Bienvenue.
Salve.
Hola.
Ni hao.
Bonjour.
No way. I got it off the line.
The first prompt we wanted to discuss with you is which programs most resonated with us. For me personally, visiting the American Business School in Paris really resonated. That's actually the program that I did 7 years ago through San Francisco State under the advisement of David Wick. Going back to that program, we talked very much about ABS's specific approach at student services. In particular, in some ways, their hands-off approach. This, for me, really related back to my studies at MIIS, where we look at the balance between creating challenging environments and also creating supportive environments for students, specifically Sanford's student development theory. So looking at not only my background and experience in my own life that really informed my entire profession and all of my studies at MIIS, what led me to this degree program, but then going back into that same environment and learning about how those facilitators and administrators lead that same program that I was able to participate in was really, really transformative for me. Also relating that back to my studies at MIIS, all around I think that was probably what resonated with me most.
Going off of that, I think the thing that stuck with me the most was the differing support systems that the programs had in place. So comparing CEA to Accent, where CEA was really focused on self-care and supporting their students, and they seem to have a really strong counseling approach to everything. Whereas Accent, they more told us stories about things that had come up over the years, but they didn't really seem to have any kind of training or program in place. So it was really interesting to see that and kind of ask questions, kind of probing that what kind of things that they do for their students.
For me, what I found really interesting was so much of our program is focused on program administration, but we also do learn a lot about pedagogy as well. And I really, I found it very interesting having had a year of experience in classes at MIIS where we learn about different pedagogies, how to engage students, and how to be really good presenters. I was able to look a little more critically at some of the sites that we visited and see them through a more critical eye, appreciate things that were done very well, but also identify things that could be improved upon. But one example that really stood out to me was at Centre Madeleine, where we were observing their orientation program. We noticed that a lot of the sessions were held with somebody standing at the front of the classroom, speaking to the class, not really engaging the students, which struck all of us a little bit, I think, because it goes so much against what we've been learning here at MIIS. But then we also recognize that there probably is a logic to this, in that they're trying to prepare students for the French university classroom, where the professors stand at the front of the class and they lecture to students. So there probably was some logic behind this, and I found it really interesting to recognize these different pedagogical strategies.
And going off of Dave's example of the Centre Madeleine, I think what really resonated with me most is Middlebury's approach and special interest in language and the linguistic portion of it. Having participated in a summer intensive language program here in California, 2 years ago, I have a deep appreciation and interest in language. So having seen the Middlebury's Abroad School and how they facilitate and structure their programs, their administration, just of their day-to-day information was so important to me, because language learning is something that I value really deeply, and something that I hope to incorporate in my professional career when I become an administrator in international education.
And in addition to visiting Centre Madeleine, as well as CEA and Accent and education abroad providers, Team France gave us the opportunity to meet with Parisian universities, Paris 7, Sciences Po, where we got the chance to learn about trends in language learning, cultural acquisition from the French context. And so for me, I was very struck by the attention, perhaps, that a lot of our hosts at the French institutions paid to more on the number of student mobility. So learning inbound, outbound student numbers, and how that is connected to the relevance or the challenges of the role of language learning. Do you want to attract more students and therefore offer more courses in English-only context, or require more of the French learning that many, I suppose, traditional or many more popular types of study abroad programs tend to offer? And so the questions about wanting your numbers to be representative or hit a critical mass, but also if the interest in language learning might be shifting in other directions, how do you address that? So in this video, we wanted to follow up on our initial conversation by focusing on the role of language learning and how we both, as participants, observers, students, I guess it's both, but coming into the program, how we wanted to address our practice and use of the French language. And so for me, because in reflecting on the different partners that we visited and how trends in language learning seem to be shifting either more towards focusing on language immersion or providing more avenues of being like English specific, I was interested in how we as a collective group of students with very different language backgrounds and different proficiencies in French came to work together in this program. And I think I was challenged by having to use a lot of terminology that I had not used before in French, in a French context. I don't know if that was something that the rest of us also felt.
I was also very impressed with the ranging language ability. We were able to form such a cohesive group. Speaking personally, I was one of, I think, the 2 students on the program that had a pretty minimal amount of French. I haven't taken any French coursework at MIIS, and I definitely don't consider myself proficient. So it was really interesting going into this program, and it actually allowed me very much to reflect on my own experience being in Paris and not speaking any French. And then further than that, I went in with this goal of figuring out what role language proficiency plays in students gaining intercultural competency. So being in these sessions where I didn't fully understand what was going on, to me, helped me to realize what else there is to gain and what a student might still benefit from when looking at gaining intercultural competency in this setting where they don't speak the language. We actually had a chance to take the IDI, which, help me out guys, Intercultural Development Inventory, correct? An assessment model which students take before and after programs. We got to take it as a group before going into this program. And in sharing our results with an administrator, she shared with us that according to the IDI, there isn't the most direct correlation between language proficiency and IDI gains on students on these programs. And it really made me think about how on earth could that be? How could it be that if students are going into programs and they don't have that ability to connect, how are they still exhibiting gains on the IDI? But being on this program, knowing all of that, allowed me to look at what do I still have to gain? And how can I change? How can I develop a new intercultural competency without the language bit? And I think for me personally, looking at getting to know a culture without the language piece really makes you sit back and observe and maybe take on a new lens of learning that you wouldn't have, being someone who relies very heavily on language and communication, not having that to fall back on. That really was what changed me and made it less of a transactional and more of a transformative experience when I was in Paris. And being there all over again and doing it with all of my classmates and being able to compare their experiences on this program and my own, that made me understand that IDI assessment and made me understand why it's still a value, but also what we have to miss out on when students don't have the language capacity or proficiency when they go on these programs.
I think for me, French was the thing that I was worried the most about because I only started learning it in June through SILP. So that was definitely something that I was very concerned about. But it was really interesting just being in France for the first time with a basic understanding of the language. It was a completely different experience than the other times I've been there, not understanding it at all. Even just trying to speak to people in French and, trying to pick up what I could. It made me think back to studying abroad in Italy where I didn't know the language at all and wondering how would that experience have been different if I had even a semester's worth, like even a basic understanding of the language. So that was something that I'm still working.
I felt the same way. One of my biggest concerns prior to going to France for this program was my language ability. I had studied French briefly several years ago, and French is not my language of study here at MIIS, so I was extremely concerned with where my proficiency was in that moment. And in addition, adding the professional context to the language exchange. And upon arrival, I feel as though, and not just speaking personally, but speaking for my classmates also, I think a lot of us really excelled in the professional setting far beyond what we had expected of ourselves. Even taking on that professional vocabulary in such a short amount of time, I was really impressed. I gained personal confidence in myself, but I also fed upon the confidence of my peers and tried to push myself even in difficult situations and when I felt uncomfortable to try to push myself linguistically, having the goal of doing more in French and going beyond what I think that I was capable of, and just trying to transcend that boundary.
I also, one thing that I was really intentional about doing on this program was trying to empathize with students who are going through this. I feel like the students who were entering with Middlebury Schools Abroad in Paris had a similar French level to what I had, and they're going through this language pledge where they're committing to only speaking French day and night, in school, with their friends, at home, wherever they are, they're only speaking French. And I would try to do that on my own, even though I didn't officially take the pledge. I would try to do that on my own sometimes. And I realized how challenging that can be, how frustrating it can be. Sometimes it went really well. Words came to me very quickly. I was able to articulate what I wanted to say very quickly with no trouble. And other times I just struggled to even start a sentence. And I had the luxury of being able to switch to English, which those students didn't. But it gave me an enormous appreciation for what they're going through. And even though I really do appreciate what they're doing, I think it's a great way to learn a language, and I understand the value of it. I also really recognize the challenges that come with it now too, and that's something that I'll carry on going into my own career designing programs. I'll have a better understanding of what these students are going to be going through if I use a language component. And one final note, I'd just like to say that at the end of the program, when we were doing our final presentations, Carol and I were presenting together, and we made the decision to present in French to a room full of people, a mix of native speakers or Americans with really good English or really good French, or some with lower levels too, and we, I think, gave a very clear presentation that hopefully everybody was able to follow. We were really proud of ourselves at the end.
They did.
It's great.
I don't know if you also wanted to. 'Cause the more I think about language and language use, I also think of nonverbal language and how that was very interesting to observe with the various learning partners that we got to meet. I'm thinking specifically at Centre Madeleine, we watched orientation, we got to see sort of how the design of the program is run. But in visiting the French institutions, the way they were communicating with us as far as design of the program and the itineraries went was very formalistic. I'm not sure that's an official word, but the way they were presenting to us one by one, almost as if they were the way that they were seeing us as, I don't know, visitors, like colleagues from another culture, and so they wanted to give us like the best self, their best self. And I thought it was very interesting the way they almost portrayed it like as kind of a diplomatic move, between two institutions, and how that speaks to the nature perhaps of partnerships with different institutions. I know it's not something that we focused or talked a lot about so far in this conversation, but I just had that thought.
They were very official with everything. I felt very organized, absolutely. I think just to touch back on what Carol brought up in the very beginning about kind of the trends in language, especially being at a school that's world renowned for its language abilities. I think we all care very much about the future of language study, and seeing kind of the downward trend in an undergraduate investment in language studies. It was so interesting getting to talk to so many different types of providers to see how they're responding to that trend. Is it that they're offering more programs in English, or like Accent was saying, offering more really content-specific courses, like teaching molecular biology in English in Paris, but how there's still a French component to be gained, even from a program that's so specific to content. I don't want to say unrelated, but very separate from Parisian culture. It was really valuable being able to gain that insight from so many different partners, and then also hearing some of that resistance. I think it was Ayusa who shared with us, they do internship placement, correct? And the difficulties that they face in having more and more applicants without a French ability, and trying to figure out how they can still derive value from these internships without the language component. Again, my personal background going abroad without the language, and trying to focus on equitable opportunities, and maybe making sure that there's still value for students who don't have the ability to learn another language before going abroad. It was really valuable for me getting to speak to professionals who have decades of experience in the field, who can attest to the benefits of language, and that we need to ensure that we don't lose that. Even if we're still creating opportunities for everyone to go abroad, how can we ensure that these language proficiency programs aren't lost? I know that really inspired me to keep making this push to making those available, and I don't know if any of you felt that way as well.
Definitely. I think the language component, it would be honestly a tragedy if study abroad moved in the direction of no language component, because kind of what we've all been touching on, language is so intertwined. There is no culture without language, verbally, non-verbally, and I think it would be a tragedy if study abroad moved in that direction without any language concentration.
And I still do think there can be culture, but I definitely think there are certain things that you just simply cannot get without communication. Absolutely. And I think looking at that trend and how we can ensure that language study isn't necessarily mandated by international education, but is encouraged For students who don't have the opportunity, maybe that immersive year-long experience in undergraduate, that is their opportunity to learn another language. And if we're not supporting those programs, then what opportunity is there not only to have the immersion, but really to make sure that students have the chance to learn another language? And once they've graduated, then where are they going to go to need that piece of it? So, yeah.
I think it's also an issue, right? Maybe it's always been an issue with this idea of what is international education. Like, we study trends where there's this idea of curriculum design, pedagogy, focusing more and more on, if English is the lingua franca right now, do we need to learn other languages, and what do we lose out by this centralization of education systems and studies? And so I personally feel like a lot gets left out in terms of the minority cultures, or just communities that get stifled because, right, if we're focusing on just let's use the universal common language, right, then not everybody might have access to that yet. And
absolutely, what communities are you missing out on in your destination because you only have the English ability? Absolutely.
Bring up some topics, which we laicite. Okay, and what can you elaborate on?